My name is Selene Ward. I joined GenV Robotics 11 years ago when the company was barely surviving its second product recall. Back then, our lab was a rented basement with flickering lights and no ventilation. But there was hope. Real hope. We believed in what we were building. That belief lasted a while until Gerald Mason took over as CEO. He wasn't from engineering, he didn't build things. He bought them, trimmed them down, and sold what was left. Under him, the culture changed. People with ideas got pushed out. People with titles got promoted. The meeting wasn't on my calendar, that was the first sign. The second was Marcus Dale, Gerald's son-in-law, already seated when I walked in. Sipping from a branded tumbler like this was a casual check-in. Gerald didn't waste time. He looked straight at the printed sheet in front of him and said, "Selene, your role has been deemed non-essential as part of the restructuring plan." He didn't ask how I was. He didn't look up. Just read the sentence as if it had no weight. I stared at him for 3 seconds, long enough to feel the silence swell in the room. Marcus wouldn't meet my eyes. I nodded once. My voice stayed even. Understood. There was no discussion. That part had already happened, just not with me in the room. They handed me a single-page exit document and instructions to return my badge by noon. That was it. 11 years of research, patents, and system designs reduced to a line item on someone else's cost-saving plan. I stood, gathered my notes, and walked out. Not a single person in the open-floor workspace lifted their head. No one dared. I had trained half of them. Fought for their bonuses, defended their mistakes when upper management wanted blood, but loyalty was quiet here. In the parking lot, I sat in my car with the engine off, letting the heat build. I wasn't frozen. I was calculating. Gerald had just made the kind of mistake no executive survives, not because he fired the wrong person, but because he forgot what I still controlled. At home, I took off my blazer, poured a glass of water, and walked to the back of my closet. Behind 2 shoeboxes was a locked fireproof safe I hadn't opened since 2019. The code still worked. Inside was a red folder, clean, labeled, and intact. It held the one thing no one had asked me about, my personal licensing agreement. I placed the folder on the table and reached for my glass. My hands were steady, not because I was calm, but because I had practiced this kind of control long before Gerald learned how to pronounce the word optimization. There's always a pause right before you open something that can change everything. It's the kind of pause where you remember what they took from you and who never said a word when it happened. And if you're still with me, whether from your office, your commute, or just a quiet afternoon, leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. If this story feels familiar, subscribe. You don't need to say much. Just knowing someone's listening is enough. Trust me, what happened next will make you question everything about how power really works in places like this. I opened the folder, turned to page 17, subsection 3. It was the clause I had asked to include back when the company still ran on common sense. All intellectual property created by employee shall remain company property, except any specifically registered patents under employee name. The system that powered every GenV robot, GenTrace, was one I had built, tested, and registered myself. And that license agreement? It was set to expire in 6 days. Gerald Mason had just fired the only person who could legally keep his company running. The next morning, while GenV was still sending out HR emails to announce leadership transitions, I was reviewing every document they had signed with me across 11 years. I didn't need revenge. I needed clarity. Legal, precise, timed. The clause in question wasn't even hidden. Section 4, subsection 3. It had been part of my employment agreement from day one, thanks to Richard Elwin, the original founder and former CEO. Before he retired, Richard made sure certain people, mostly engineers, had protections built into their contracts. He believed innovation needed safeguards, especially when leadership changed. Back then, he looked me in the eye and said, "Selene, you can't build an empire if you don't own your bricks." So I patented GenTrace under my name and licensed it to the company. Richard signed off on it personally. Gerald Mason, however, had never read that far. The licensing agreement for GenTrace was clean. It gave GenV Robotics full access to use the system for internal production and client deployment, but only during the active license period. No modification, no sublicensing, and no continuation after expiry without renewal. They had 6 days left. I scanned the signature page. Gerald's name wasn't on it. He hadn't even been with the company then. I made a note of that. Marcus Dale wasn't anywhere near the board when this was signed either. Another note. By noon, I'd organized the full chain of agreements into a secure folder on a backup drive. I labeled it, "If they touch anything." Because they would. Gerald didn't believe in engineers. He believed in margins. He didn't see me as a liability because of GenTrace. He saw me as overhead, an expensive holdover from an older era, someone too quiet to notice, too loyal to push back. That kind of thinking makes people sloppy. The next step wasn't to wait for them to call. It was to be 5 steps ahead. I booted up an old laptop I hadn't used since 2020, my personal offline dev machine where the earliest versions of GenTrace were written. It wasn't connected to anything, not even the company's cloud, but it held the full commit history, timestamps, Git logs, original comments, design notes in plain text. Every line of code from the very first build was still there. I pulled the patent registration from the drawer, printed under my name, registered with the Federal Patent Office. Licensing agreement signed by Gen V. License expiration, exactly 6 days from now, and that's 11:59 p.m. I made another copy, uploaded it to an encrypted vault, sent a copy to my legal contact just in case. Then I did something I hadn't planned to, something I'd built into GenTrace years ago, but never thought I'd need. Back when we deployed the 3rd version of the system, I embedded a security protocol that ran silent checks for license validation every 12 hours. It wasn't designed to disrupt, just to remind internal servers to confirm that usage was still authorized. If the system didn't detect an active license, it reverted to its base mode. That mode didn't disable anything. It just locked out every premium layer, the machine learning calibration, the adaptive gesture modules, the smooth feedback loop that made GenTrace so effective. In other words, the robots would still move, but not well, and certainly not safely. No one else knew about that layer. It wasn't malicious. It was protection. Gerald Mason fired me thinking he removed a person. He didn't realize he'd also started a timer, and the first alarm would ring in less than 144 hours. 3 days after I was fired, I received a text from someone I hadn't heard from since that hallway goodbye. It was from Haley Ung, my former team lead for systems integration. "They just introduced your replacement, some guy named Lucas Bell. Says he's here to take us into the next wave of intelligent automation." I stared at the message. Lucas Bell. The name meant nothing to me. I replied simply, "What's his background?" Seconds later, "Influencer. Writes about AI disruption on LinkedIn. No engineering degree, no product credits, but he's got a podcast. Gerald's obsessed." It didn't surprise me. Gerald Mason didn't care about knowledge. He cared about image. Lucas probably wore designer glasses and spoke in slogans that looked good on pitch decks. The kind of person who could say nothing with great confidence and get a standing ovation. What did surprise me was how fast they moved. Most companies take weeks to replace a senior technical lead. Gen V took 3 days. That told me one thing. This wasn't a mistake. It was a plan. That afternoon, another message came in, this time from Haley again. "Emergency team meeting just ended. Lucas says GenTrace is outdated. He wants to rebuild it from scratch. Gerald approved." I put my glass down slowly. Rebuild it? They couldn't. Not without violating the licensing agreement. Not without ripping into code they no longer had permission to touch. And not without understanding what they were doing. I pulled out the PDF of the original agreement, highlighted Clause 9.2. Any attempt to replicate, modify, or extend the system without explicit written authorization shall constitute breach of contract and grounds for immediate legal action. This wasn't just sloppy anymore. This was direct. I called Rachel, my attorney. She had been helping me sort the archive of documents since the day I left. "Hey, quick update," I said. "They've announced a full rebuild, using GenTrace as the base." There was silence on the line. Then she said, "They're doing this before the license expires?" "Yeah." That's violation number 1, she said. Forward everything to me, time-stamped if possible. I did. Texts, screen captures, file names, all of it. Then I sat down and opened the monitoring dashboard. Back in 2021, I had built an internal notification tool that pinged me if any part of Gentrace's protected code was accessed without proper clearance. Not because I expected sabotage, but because I'd seen too many engineers lose their work to bad managers with better titles. The alert log was blinking. I opened it. Timestamp 1442, today. Location, GenV Robotics, server instance 7B, user l.bell@gnv.ai. He'd already started rewriting part of the authentication layer, badly. The new lines of code weren't just inefficient, they skipped key security protocols and commented out stability checks. He wasn't just guessing, he was undoing. I opened the diff file and exported it into my case folder. Then I paused. This wasn't just violation number 1, this was proof. Proof that even before the license expired, they were tearing down what they didn't understand, trying to wear my work like it was theirs. I typed one line into my legal folder's header. They just pressed the first domino. And I hadn't even sent my warning yet. The change in the code wasn't dramatic. In fact, that was the problem. It looked subtle, like someone tweaking around the edges. But to anyone who knew Gentrace, it was clear. They had crossed a line. An internal commit had just been pushed to the motion control module, bypassing safety calibrations I'd spent years perfecting. There were no checks, no backups, no understanding of what those lines actually did, and they'd done it without permission. It was the first true breach. I logged the event in my private archive, copied the access record, and sent the update to Rachel, who had been quietly tracking everything with me. We both knew what this meant. Not speculation, not intent. A confirmed violation, before the license had even expired. We spent that evening preparing a formal notice. It didn't threaten anything. It didn't argue. It simply clarified what the company had forgotten. That the system they were tampering with was licensed, not owned, and that license had a clock on it. We sent it to GenV's legal team the next morning through official channels. A short, clear reminder that Gentrace was my property, and any unauthorized access or modification would carry legal consequences once the license expired. It was delivered, documented, and signed for. A few hours later, I received a discreet message from Ray, one of the lawyers inside GenV. He didn't editorialize, just informed me that Gerald had read the letter, laughed it off, and thrown it in the trash in front of several staff. He had no intention of taking it seriously. I made sure to log that response too. Ray mentioned that he had already recorded the notice as formally received. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added that some people inside the company were paying attention, even if they weren't saying it out loud. That told me enough. I didn't need them to believe me. I needed them to ignore me just long enough. That evening, I checked the system logs again. Another access had been registered. This time, they weren't just adjusting the system, they were replacing entire modules. One of the gesture control subsystems had been rewritten from scratch, removing stability buffers and collapsing logic trees. The new version was lighter, yes, but not safer, not tested, not even sound. It was the kind of edit that looked impressive in a demo and dangerous in the real world, but I wasn't there to stop it. I wasn't there to explain, so the system did what I had built it to do. It logged the change, copied the original, preserved the timestamp, and flagged the violation under the proper license ID. The second domino had fallen, and still, no one on their side had looked down to see the mess they were making. I archived the new logs, labeled them clearly, and added them to the file I'd been building in silence. Every step they took was being recorded, not by me, but by the very system they believed they could control. And soon, that belief would cost them everything. It happened faster than I expected. By Friday morning, the first client demonstration with Lucas's modified version of Gentrace was scheduled, one of the biggest potential contracts GenV had ever chased. Surgeon Assist Robotics for Veritas MedTech, a single deal worth millions and years of rollout if it worked. I wasn't supposed to know about it, but Haley, who had quietly left the company the day after my dismissal, still had friends inside. She forwarded me what she'd heard. The team had rolled out Lucas's version into the demo robot, claiming it was faster, smoother, more agile. No one had tested it outside the lab. That afternoon, while I was organizing the next batch of backup logs, I received another message. The test unit malfunctioned mid-demo. In front of the Veritas executive team, the robot arm twitched during a simulated medical handoff, moved out of alignment, and slammed into the edge of a prototype device. A crash, audible, embarrassing, expensive. The room, I was told, went dead silent. The damage to the prototype was repairable. The damage to trust wasn't. Veritas halted the demo, requested an internal review, and warned that if the issue wasn't resolved immediately, they'd take their business elsewhere. I didn't celebrate. That wasn't the point. But the irony didn't escape me. Lucas had sold them a vision, and that vision had just knocked a multi-million-dollar opportunity off the table. Later that evening, I received a message from Haley again. She had spoken with someone still on the team. Apparently, Gerald's solution to the failure was simple. Blame me. He told the executive floor that the crash was caused by instability in the legacy version of GenTrace, the same version I had designed, maintained, and documented for nearly a decade. The same version that hadn't failed once before Lucas arrived. That was the moment I understood something deeply important. Gerald wasn't just ignoring my warnings, he was preparing to rewrite the story entirely. Erase my name, blame my code, cover the damage by pushing the fault onto someone no longer in the room. But he'd made one crucial mistake. I still had access to every edit they'd made since my departure. The unauthorized rebuilds, the timestamps, the exact lines they had changed, removed, or skipped. Haley sent me something else, logs from inside the demo unit. She had asked a friend to extract them before they were erased. They confirmed what I already knew. The version of the system used in the demo had removed every core safeguard I had built. Lucas hadn't optimized the platform. He had gutted it. And now they were trying to say that failure belonged to me. They weren't just rewriting code. They were trying to rewrite history, but I wasn't gone, and my systems had been keeping score since day one. After the Veritas demo collapsed, Gen V had two options: acknowledge what went wrong or find someone to blame. They chose the second. From what I gathered through quiet updates, Gerald held a leadership meeting that same evening, insisting the error was a result of my outdated engineering mindset. He spoke confidently, frustrated, certain he could spin this into a necessary transition. A purge of the old to make room for the visionary new. But what he didn't know, and likely still hadn't read, was that the license Gen V depended on was set to expire in less than 48 hours. There would be no transition, no rebranding of the blame. There would only be consequences. Saturday morning, I took a train across the city to meet with David Lin, my former mentor from the early days of GenTrace. He now led the intellectual property division at a firm known for not losing. I had kept him in the loop from the beginning, but now it was time to move formally. I handed over a complete archive: system logs, commit records, internal messages, device IDs, and a breakdown of every unauthorized edit made since my departure. He read through the timeline, asked two questions, and then looked up. "This is clean," he said. "They've ignored your notice, violated the terms, altered your code, and now they're blaming you for their failure." He assigned a team to draft the cease and desist. The final one. No reminders, no grace period, no space left for misunderstanding. The letter was delivered by hand to Gerald's home address before sunset. It gave them until Sunday night, midnight exactly, to either renew the license under new terms or face an immediate legal injunction, asset freeze, and notification to all clients regarding unauthorized use of patented systems. There would be no more silence. Back home, I updated the final log file. The security protocol I had written years ago had already begun preparing for what came next. If the license wasn't active when the internal verification check ran at 12:01 a.m. Monday, the system would respond automatically, not out of revenge. Just because that's what it was built to do. And I knew they hadn't renewed. They hadn't even replied. Late that night, I received one last quiet message from Ray inside legal. He confirmed the letter had been received, confirmed it had been discussed, and dismissed again. Gerald was doubling down. He told the board it was a bluff, that I was desperate, that legal would handle it. But Ray didn't sound convinced. He didn't say it outright, but the way he phrased his final sentence was clear. Just make sure everything on your side is documented. I have a feeling the rest of us will need it soon. The system check was set. The countdown had already begun, and when the clock ran out, the machines wouldn't ask permission. At exactly 12:01 a.m. on Monday, the license expired. No warning, no sound. Just a silent pivot written deep inside the system. GenTrace did what it was designed to do. It checked for a valid license key, found none, and quietly dropped into fallback mode. Not broken, not hostile, just uninterested. By morning, it had already spread. I didn't need access to see it, I just had to watch the ripple. Operations slowed across every active deployment. Arms stopped mid-motion. Sorting bots skipped alignment. Delivery units delayed without explanation. Precision was gone. What remained was only a basic skeletal framework, barely functional, wholly legal. Haley forwarded a screenshot from an internal dashboard at 8:47 a.m. The subject line just read, "All sites red." By 9, calls were piling up. Fulfillment contracts on hold, medical units offline. Gerald had ordered a series of emergency resets, but nothing changed. They tried backups, mirror servers, older builds. None of them mattered. Every instance of GenTrace, no matter how old or untouched, still ran one silent rule: check the license. If it's not there, revert. The system wasn't malfunctioning, it was obeying. Internally, panic moved faster than code. Managers blamed infrastructure. Engineers blamed calibration. No one wanted to say the truth aloud, that the architecture itself had drawn a line, and they had crossed it. Gerald refused to accept it. He told the board it was a delay, a bug, something technical. He promised resolution within hours, but the machines kept ignoring commands. Production floors turned quiet. I heard from one technician who described it as watching a trained dog stop listening mid-command. By noon, 3 major clients had pulled out of current cycles. The stock dropped 8%. Analysts on external calls began asking questions the board couldn't answer, and Lucas, the one brought in to revolutionize the system, hadn't shown up all day. I didn't need to say anything. The code was saying it for me. Gerald called again, this time sounding like someone rehearsing a surrender disguised as a compromise. He left a voicemail, said we should find a solution, that he was open to discussing terms. His tone was flatter now, less certain, more aware of just how far this had already gone. I didn't return the call, not yet. I sent the recording to David Lynn and added it to the archive. We had agreed, no response until the consequences were undeniable. By the time the board realized what was happening, fallback mode had been active for over 10 hours. GenTrace wasn't rebelling, it wasn't crashing, it wasn't fighting anyone, it had simply withdrawn, because that's what happens when something no longer belongs to you. By Monday afternoon, the silence inside GenV Robotics had turned into something else: dead air. Systems that once moved with flawless precision were reduced to clunky hesitation. Operators stood in silence, staring at dashboards filled with red blocks and error codes that made no sense to them. The fallback mode wasn't new. It had always been there, but no one thought it would ever activate. They had never imagined what it would feel like when the machines stopped trusting them. Gerald Mason had no updates for the board. The usual performance slide deck was canceled. Instead, he stood in front of a video conference screen while shareholders watched the company bleed 8% of its value in a single day. The language shifted. What had started as technical turbulence became temporary disruption, then unexpected regression. But no matter how he spun it, the pattern was obvious. Everything that relied on GenTrace had fractured overnight. At 2 o'clock, Gerald tried again. This time, I answered. He didn't waste time with greetings. He said the company was ready to restore the agreement and that he hoped we could return to the previous working arrangement. It was an attempt to reframe the disaster as a misunderstanding. I told him, clearly and calmly, that the previous agreement was no longer available. They had voided it when they breached the licensing terms and altered the system without consent. If GenV wanted to use GenTrace again, it would be on entirely new terms. That evening, I sent him the updated offer, a $1.5 million annual licensing fee, renewable quarterly, and reviewed at my discretion. Public and permanent patent attribution in all external and internal materials. A dedicated engineering sub-team reporting directly to me as an independent systems consultant, and most importantly, a binding clause prohibiting all unauthorized modifications, enforced with financial and legal penalties. It was not a negotiation. It was a reality they had created for themselves. Less than 30 minutes later, Gerald called again. This time, his voice cracked. He accused me of extortion. Said no board would approve such terms, claimed I was holding the company hostage. I didn't argue. I simply reminded him that GenTrace wasn't part of Gen V. It was licensed. It had always been licensed. They were free to walk away. They just wouldn't walk far. That night, a formal meeting invitation appeared in my inbox. Legal negotiations Tuesday morning at my firm's office. When I walked into the boardroom, David Lynn was already there, collected, calm, unmoved. On the other side sat Gerald, his son-in-law Marcus, and Sandra from Gen V's legal department. Their posture was stiff, defensive, the kind of body language you see when people already know the outcome but are still pretending it's undecided. Gerald started by sliding a printed sheet across the table. A counteroffer. A one-time payment of $250,000 for full ownership of the GenTrace patent. I didn't look at David. He didn't touch the paper. No reaction was needed. We let the silence speak first. Then David stated what everyone already knew. The system was worth far more than that, and more importantly, the company didn't own it. Gerald tried to argue that GenTrace had been developed while I was employed, and that the licensing clause was a technicality. I reminded him, without raising my voice, that the system had been built off-site, on my personal equipment, during the very months when Gen V had slashed its entire research budget. The legal filings confirmed that. The original contract confirmed that, and so did Richard Elwin, the former CEO, who had advised me to patent it myself. Gerald dismissed Richard's judgment as sentimental, said he didn't understand business. I didn't need to respond. Instead, I reached into my folder and pulled out a small voice recorder. I played 7 seconds of a clip forwarded to me by someone who still worked at Gen V. Gerald's voice filled the room, arrogant and careless, from a meeting just days earlier. "We don't need Celine anymore. She's just expensive baggage from the old team." I stopped the recording there. No one at the table said a word. The board didn't call me right away, but they didn't take long either. Less than 24 hours after that negotiation meeting, I received a message from Janet Miles, chair of Gen V's board of directors. It was brief and direct. The board had been made aware of significant system failures, contractual irregularities, and legal vulnerabilities related to the GenTrace platform. They were calling an emergency meeting and requested that I present my side, along with documentation. She didn't mention Gerald by name. She didn't have to. The meeting took place over video early Wednesday morning. I sat in David Lynn's office, surrounded by carefully labeled files, archived logs, and one binder I hoped we wouldn't even need to open. Gerald looked different, not dressed down but drained, the kind of face that knew the walls were closing in but hadn't quite figured out which ones were moving. He opened with a familiar script, blamed the disruptions on legacy code, on internal miscommunication, on misaligned understanding of the licensing terms. He spoke for 6 minutes straight. No one interrupted him. When he finished, Janet turned to me and said, "Ms. Ward, please walk us through your position." I didn't rush. I didn't grandstand. I opened my folder, shared my screen, and walked them through the facts, one at a time. The original employment contract, the licensing agreement, the clause protecting registered patents, the system logs showing unauthorized modifications, the messages confirming license expiry, the cease and desist letter, the voicemail, the counteroffer. I showed them the license verification protocol in action, demonstrated how every system failure they'd experienced was not sabotage, not malfunction, but the result of a license they had failed to renew. The fallback mode had done what it was designed to do. Then I paused and added one last item, the recording, just the same 7 seconds they'd heard in that law firm. "We don't need Celine anymore. She's just expensive baggage from the old team." When the clip ended, I said nothing. For a moment, no one did. Then Dr. Allen, a longtime board member and former MIT advisor, spoke. He said he'd worked with me before Gen V, knew my ethics, my track record, my standards. He confirmed that what I'd presented wasn't just thorough, it was indisputable. Another board member asked Janet why they hadn't been informed of the license issue earlier. Janet admitted the board had only learned of it after the client fallout. Gerald had chosen not to escalate it. Her tone was steady, controlled, but firm. Gerald tried to interject, something about streamlining leadership, about innovation needing flexibility, but the momentum had shifted. Janet thanked me and asked me to disconnect while the board deliberated. I closed my laptop and sat quietly, not anxious, not proud, just still. An hour later, David received a call. Gerald Mason had been placed on immediate administrative leave, pending full investigation. Marcus was suspended. Sandra's department was under audit. Janet Miles would serve as interim CEO until further notice. They were conducting a full review of all recent terminations, hirings, and licensing practices. When I heard the news, I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just nodded, because it was never about revenge. It was about restoring balance in a system that had convinced itself it couldn't be questioned. I didn't return to Gen V the way most people do. There was no badge reissued, no HR welcome email, no awkward small talk by the elevators. When I walked back into the building, it was as an external partner. Contract in hand, terms in place, name on the patent. They didn't hire me back. They licensed what they could no longer steal. My first meeting as systems consultant was in the same boardroom where they fired me. Janet sat at the head now. Gerald's chair stayed empty. Across from me were engineers who'd once been silent. This time, they listened. We restored production within the week. I rehired Haley, brought back the engineers who had walked out during the chaos, rebuilt the trust one structure at a time, not fast, not loud, just real. A month later, Gen V issued a formal press release. They acknowledged me as the creator of GenTrace, confirmed full attribution, and announced the formation of an internal audit team dedicated to ensuring all future innovations were credited properly. The first system reviewed? Mine. But the part they didn't mention publicly? Gerald had already moved on to a new startup in a different city, pitching something proprietary, a system suspiciously similar to GenTrace. Sandra, from legal, called to warn me. I didn't panic. We already had the commit logs, the backups, the license trail, the patents. We filed suit before his pitch deck even reached investors. That was the last time they tried to erase someone like me. But what happened in the audit room 2 floors below? That's a different kind of silence, and a very different kind of revenge.